also really happy and surprised to see so many folks joining us, not only because this work means so much to us, but because it shows that people care about the topic and about working with Indigenous partners and communities and peoples in a good way. So this just really makes my heart glow. So I am going to start with a story. So storytelling is something that we really try to center in the project that we did and in this Lunch and Learn. So every time there will be a story, most likely. And this story is one new voice message. To play your messages, press 1 to record. Have I been muted the whole time?
Just right after I muted right now.
Okay, perfect. So the story is meant to contextualize why we're doing this in the first place. As community engaged learning coordinators, as people who work directly with Indigenous communities in Canada and also in other countries. So that's why I'm going to tell it. And the story has to do with when I first started at the university 4 years ago in this role. My portfolio included a program that happens in Ecuador. And it was a reading week program. We take students to Ecuador for 10 days, and the learning objectives were very broad, but they're always social justice oriented. So I came in December, and the program was during reading week in February, so I didn't really have a ton of time to plan and change a lot of things. And how it was set up is that we were working with a sort of like a travel agency at the time. So they would be our third party that interface with the people who we were going to interact and stay with in Ecuador. And they were like, this agency was really nice. They were very professional in many ways. But I started asking questions regarding who were actually going to host us, like who were the people who we were going to stay with, because the itinerary was set for the Amazon, sort of like communities along the Amazon River, but they didn't really specify who they were. So when I started asking, who are they? Can I get in touch with them? Can you give me more information? They said, no, this information is sort of like private. It's just for us. So that was a little red flag for me. Then I started asking more questions like, okay, well, we're paying this fee. Can you tell us like how much the people who are hosting us are actually getting from this money? Because it's the money that students are paying. So they also didn't really want to tell much information about these things. But the trip was coming up, so there wasn't really a lot of time to change things. So I went down, and everyone we worked with was part of Indigenous communities. We're Indigenous peoples of Ecuador, of the Amazon region, who had their own tourist enterprises to sort of like make their living. So the more I was there and the more I talked to them, I realized that they didn't know anything about who we were, why we were going there. There was just complete disconnection between them and us. So we had an amazing time sharing with them. When I came back to Canada, to the university, and I started talking with Annie and Nikki. Well, Nikki wasn't here at the time; it was just Annie. Started talking with Annie and or ED. We realized that those practices were really wrong in terms of how the university engages sometimes with communities. Like in this case, to a third party who treated the experience as a business. It wasn't really anything beyond a business for them. So we started looking at everything that we do beyond that program and finding that we could do better. We could really do better in different ways in how we work with Indigenous communities and communities in general. So this is sort of one of the stories of other stories that are in the background of why we created this framework and why we're doing these lunch and learns, because it came from our own awareness that the university can do better in how we engage. So, I mean, just FYI, that program still exists, but we like flipped it 180 degrees. Now we work directly with communities with whom spend years building that relationship before actually taking students. But we'll talk about that later. So thank you everyone for listening, and I'll give the mic back to Nikki.
Thanks, Hedda. And actually, I think Annie right now is going to introduce our team and our office.
Also my cat Athena. I'm sure all of you have that experience. So thanks very much, Hedda, for sharing that experience of what led us to do this work. We just wanted to share a little bit about each of us so that you know who we are, but all three of us, Annie, Hedda, Nikki, the three of us, we work in Community Engaged Learning, which is a department that's part of Student Engagement and Success, which is part of Student Affairs at the University of Manitoba. So for myself, I'm a Canadian-born Chinese settler. So my parent generation moved here as refugees and immigrants. And I was born in Northern BC and have lived here in Winnipeg on Treaty 1 territory for most of my life, only really started doing work with Indigenous communities as a result of my position at the University of Manitoba. And I work with folks in Northern Manitoba, in Winnipeg, and also in the past have worked with folks in Maya communities in Belize. Nikki?
Hi, everybody. So my name is Nikki. I'm the CEL coordinator Indigenous. I'm a Métis woman from a small town called Lorette, Manitoba, which is just about 25 kilometers southeast of Winnipeg. So my background is actually in sort of Indigenous and Aboriginal rights. And I've also done a lot of work in the area of Indigenous and anti-racist education. And most recently, I'm just completing my master's in Indigenous land-based education at the University of Saskatchewan. And so in my role as CEL coordinator, I facilitate a land-based education program, mainly with elders, knowledge holders in the sort of Winnipeg and surrounding communities. But as sort of project lead for this project that we're talking to you about today, the Working in Good Ways project, I've gotten a chance to work with communities all across Manitoba. So in Northern Manitoba and in sort of the Interlake region. So we're going to talk to you about that in a bit, but I'll pass it over to Hedda.
Thanks, Nikki. So I can see myself on the big screen, but I trust that people can see me and hear me. My name is Hedda. I also work with Annie and Nikki. I live here in Winnipeg, Treaty 1, with my wife and my daughter, Anicia, who is turning 1 in 4 days. What can I tell you? So most of my work happens with partners in Latin America. So community of midwives, Quichua midwives and doulas in Ecuador, and an artist collective in Chile. But I also have friends and other relationships in different parts of Latin America. And academically, my background is in philosophy. I have a master's in philosophy, interested in political, ethical philosophy, in the philosophy of liberation. And if you ever want to talk philosophy, I'd love to do that. That's me.
Thanks, folks. So together, along with many amazing student staff, we make up Community Engaged Learning. And as you might be able to guess from our name, our office really believes in the pedagogy of learning from and from within communities. So both in terms of our mindsets of, what is the ultimate goal of why we are pursuing post-secondary education, and also in terms of location, that classrooms are not just within the four walls of the institutions of our campuses, but also within communities themselves. And so we try to connect students in that way. We try to create opportunities for learning on campus and off campus, where students have the chance to connect with community members, to learn about community work, and to figure out their role in community, and to understand their studies as that you're at university to figure out how you fit into making the world a healthier, safer, liberatory space for people. And so regardless of the students' disciplines, that's ultimately our goal, is to think of ourselves as part of a collective, and that we have responsibilities to each other, and to find the way that we can take care of each other and ourselves. So as Hedda's story kind of shared with you, we are always learning. So our office had the many experiences and ongoing experiences of seeing where we make mistakes in the way that we work with community, and also, trying to appreciate and be grateful for when we do things in a way that seems to be working and seems to be positive for people. But we really realized areas that we could improve, and so we were able to apply to the Indigenous Initiatives Fund to do some consultations with our community partners, to listen to what they had to say and create a framework for ourselves to guide our own work. And so that's really where this project started, was to work with our particular partners. So it's not a pan-Indigenous framework. It is specifically, we've talked to our partners who are Anishinaabe, Cree, Quechua, Mapuche, and Maya, Quechua Maya mostly. And so we have worked with our partners to hear what they have to say, and we've created a framework to guide our work. But we also hope that this framework is useful to other people. And we are really interested in the framework document, this guide, as well as the online course that we are creating, and these lunch and learn sessions that they'll act as a place to foster a community of practice for people who are creating these learning opportunities for students with Indigenous communities, right? So whether you are a university practitioner or a community member, Indigenous community member, or a student who's interested in this pedagogy, that we can gather together and learn from each other, and learn from what community has told us, and try to change our own practices, and also the way that the university works, so that it can work in a better way and make things more accessible, reduce barriers, and center the goals and wishes of our partners in the different Indigenous communities that we do work with. So that's what we're hoping for out of this, is a chance to share what we heard, a chance to share our stories, to ask questions, and to learn from each other. And today is a broad overview, and I'm going to hand it back to Nikki for her to share some gratitudes.
Thank you, Annie. And so actually, just before I share some gratitudes, I want to tell you a little bit about what the Lunch and Learn series is going to look like, so you know what to expect. So just, feel free to eat your lunch. This is the lunch hour. So, and again, when you arrive, much like today, we're going to potentially put you in a breakout room to mingle around until we get started, just because we know folks have other things leading up to these meetings. So sometimes they straggle in. So we'll probably get started around 12:05. And then we're going to do kind of what we did today. So we're going to always start with a story, and that story is going to be one of our stories as folks who are doing this work, or one of the stories that we heard from our consultation participants. And that story is going to really illustrate or sort of grapple with something to do with the topic for the day. And then we're going to share what we actually heard and learned in our consultations. And then finally, we're going to engage with some sort of resource or tool that, again, sort of, is really related to the topic of the day. And I'm going to share our poster with you in a second, so you'll see what's coming up. And then so that'll be kind of from noon to 1. And then if folks are able to stick around, that would be really great, because from 1 to 2, we're going to have a community engagement advising hour. And so we're going to have us as our CL coordinators who did some of this work and have all these stories now to share with you, and as well as maybe guest advisors who are there to answer questions or share experiences, listen to your story, and provide like feedback and advice if possible. So stick around for that second hour if you can. that's when we're going to kind of, grapple with things and get into the nitty gritty stuff. So just before we launch into sort of the framework overview for today, which is today's topic, I want to share some gratitude, as Annie mentioned. So we just want to acknowledge and thank the elders, teachers, mentors, partners, and all of the consultation partners who worked with us over the course of like the last 2.5, 3 years that we've been working on this project. So over the course of this project, we consulted with nearly 100 individuals representing more than a dozen nations, including those CEL partners that Annie named. So Anishinaabe communities, Cree communities, Quechua, Kichwa, and Mapuche communities, and many others as well, of course. So without their guidance and knowledge and experience, which informed our work, we wouldn't have been able to create this framework, which again has been super helpful already to our office, and we're hoping will be helpful to you. So we're going to share those stories and their experiences and their words with you over the course of this Lunch and Learn series. So, okay, now open your chat function if you haven't already, because I'm going to drop in a couple of things. So I'm going to drop in our poster, which you've probably seen because you're here. But just in case you want to kind of check as we're talking about some of these principles that we're about to talk about to see when we're going to talk about those, it lists the topics and the dates on that poster. And then I've also dropped in a handout. And the handout has 2 pages. One is an infographic that talks about our principles, and the second is a pathway to Indigenous community engagement. So first, we're going to open up that principle document. And I actually think I'm going to share my screen with you, at least for a little while. Oh, you know what? I have it open already. Oh, okay, so I'm going to screen share. So I think I can go like this. Okay, so can folks see my screen? You'll also have that, of course, in front of you if you open up the handout in the chat. I don't know if it's uploaded yet, but it will be available to you soon if it's not already. So essentially, this is a draft document that we've prepared. We're going to kind of keep refining it over the course of the Lunch and Learn series. And it will be finalized for the launch of our framework document, which is going to happen in April, just a few months away. So essentially, as Annie mentioned, what we did in this project was we set out to create this like framework to help kind of guide our work, to help us work in good ways with our community partners. And so what came out of our consultations with community partners and other folks, including like staff, faculty, and students at the University of Manitoba and other institutions as well, was that we were able to sort of take all this consultation data, like what we heard from folks, and distill it into these 8 principles, as well, and also 5 stages, which we'll look at in a second, and a relational assessment guide too, which we'll talk about a little later on today. So I'm just going to kind of briefly overview these 8 principles today. And obviously we're going to go much more in depth into them in each of their particular Lunch and Learn sessions. So again, if you're interested, we hope that you'll attend the other 9 sessions. And those dates are listed. It's every second Thursday. Those dates are listed on your poster. So these 8 principles, again, are really what we heard from the community. So if you look at the literacy principle, literacy provides a foundation for better understanding and adapting to those different ways that Indigenous communities work with and relate to others. It helps us to be anti-racist and anti-colonial. It also helps us to contextualize some of those contemporary experiences that Indigenous peoples in Canada have experienced. So both with historic colonization, but also this ongoing colonialism that communities and individuals and nations continue to experience. So in this session, we're actually going to share ways that you can develop your literacy in Indigenous topics and avoid a pan-Indigenous approach. So we talk about that a lot in the framework, and communities were really adamant too that it's important to really be specific and avoid sort of pan-Indigenization. The second principle is reflection. So in Indigenous community engagement, there are some like really key areas for critical reflection that we think that, you know, as practitioners working with community that you should engage in and that we should engage in. So some of these areas include knowing your own story, particularly in relation to Indigenous peoples and lands, and also clarifying your motivation for working with Indigenous communities. So these are determining factors for earning trust and building relationships with Indigenous people, you know, like who you are and why you're doing this work, and why particularly, you know, potentially as a non-Indigenous person, you want to work with Indigenous communities. And then other areas for critical reflection include situating yourself within settler colonialism and anti-Indigenous racism. So that helps develop your awareness of your own biases and prejudices. And then finally recognizing how you learn, work, and relate to others. So that's going to help you notice these cultural differences and also adapt to be able to work, adapt to like Indigenous ways of learning and working and relating. So in this session, we're actually going to engage in critical reflection. We're going to engage in critical reflection in all of the sessions because it's so key. But one of the recommendations in there is actually to seek community engagement and advising and to find a community of practice. So, you know, we're here, we started that work already. So then the third principle here is relationship. So relationality and relational accountability are these understandings that we're all related and we're responsible for our relationships. So these are core values that really underpin many Indigenous worldviews, and they underpin the Indigenous community engagement practice as well. So unlike this typical sort of professional relationship that we might have experienced with non-Indigenous partners or even Indigenous partners in the past, we need to really prepare ourselves for relationships with Indigenous partners that are personal, that exist outside of and beyond a formal partnership structure, and beyond our, you know, programs and projects as well. So working with Indigenous communities really requires this willingness to take a different approach to community engagement, one that values like real caring personal relationships. So if we want to work with Indigenous communities, we have to demonstrate that we have this shared value and capacity to develop these meaningful, trusting, and long-lasting relationships. So because those relationships ultimately are going to be what sustains the partnership. So in this session, we're going to talk about, you know, how to actually go about building those relationships, how to honor the spirit of Indigenous relationality and what that is, and how to engage in relational accountability. So that idea that it's like we follow up on our relationships, we follow up in action. The next principle is reciprocity. So reciprocity is more than remuneration and resourcing. It's more than just, you know, providing your communities with the things that they need to host students or paying them, you know, paying your local coordinator. It's beyond those things. And so although CEL practitioners often assume that Indigenous communities benefit from partnering with us, through like student service, for instance, or through monetary contributions, Indigenous communities actually experience very little real benefit from their involvement in our work. So actually one of the things that, you know, kind of came out of our consultations was the fact that post-secondary institutions are the main beneficiaries of community partnerships because it allows those institutions to fulfill educational, research, and social mandates. So in this session, we explore the meaning of reciprocity beyond this sort of tit for tat idea. We share practices that help us break a history of one-sided partnerships, and we outline the basic conditions that have to be in place before reciprocity can be felt. So that's going to be a really interesting session. They're all going to be very interesting. Protocol is the next principle. So protocols are nation and community specific practices that reflect the values, beliefs, and ways of life of a community and the relationship with each other, with the land, and with other beings. So acknowledging and following protocols are an important marker of respect and trustworthiness. Failure to do so says that you believe, or we believe, I should say, that, you know, settler ways are better. And if you take a pan-Indigenous approach to protocols, it sort of demonstrates your lack of regard and recognition for distinct and sovereign Indigenous nations. So engaging in protocol is what makes collaboration and consultation between Indigenous communities and universities possible. In this session, we're going to share recommendations to help you learn about and follow protocols. And we're going to talk about how to overcome mistakes, because it may be that, you know, we've already engaged with communities and we've missed some of these important steps. And so how do we go back and overcome some of these, you know, mistakes and repair relationships if needed? The next principle is humility. So community engaged learning practitioners and students typically position themselves as settler experts who come to serve like underprivileged Indigenous communities. But in reality, we know that Indigenous communities are experts in Indigenous community engaged learning, or sorry, in community engaged learning generally. And their expertise extends beyond limited sort of settler understandings of what constitutes Indigenous knowledge, so things like hunting and trapping, and actually include, you know, things like governance, education, healthcare, economics, like all these, you know, sort of much broader disciplines. So when we work from a place of humility, it means seeing ourselves as helpers and learners, listening and supporting the visions of Indigenous communities so that you can align your work with theirs, and challenging settler colonialism in ourselves and in our institutions so that we can engage with Indigenous-led work, worldviews, and approaches. So in this session, we consider what our roles are and what we can actually contribute in our community work. The next principle is collaboration. So historically, that term collaboration has kind of been tokenized in the context of Indigenous community engagement to misrepresent Indigenous consent, support, and participation in settler projects, when folks have actually had kind of very little real power to shape or challenge or veto that work. So true collaboration, what we heard from our partners was that true collaboration means that Indigenous communities have comparative or even greater power in deciding the kind of work that needs to be done in their community, why it needs to be done, how it should be done, in order to benefit the community. So in this session, we share critical anti-oppressive and anti-colonial approaches to steer our work in ways that are actually going to benefit the communities that we work with. And finally, I've sort of just been shouting information at you. Finally, the last principle is systems change. So oftentimes institutional systems create burdens for Indigenous community partners and barriers to Indigenous community engaged learning in general. So in this session, we're going to share and discuss strategies to initiate institutional change within our institutions to make Indigenous community learning more just and equitable. So those are the 8 principles. These principles, again, have sort of been distilled from, you know, many analyses of everything that we heard from our community partners over the last few years. And so we're going to get sort of more in depth, and we're going to explore these topics, what we heard, stories that people shared with us. And for each of those sections, there is a resource or tool as well that we'll engage with in those upcoming sessions. Just checking the... Okay, I was just checking the notes really quickly. So we're just going to super fast go into the pathway, and I'm really just going to focus on a couple of the most important sections there. So if you open up the pathway document, again, I can share on my screen. This is for some reason, the color shows up very strangely on my screen. It may be green for you, but it looks purple for me. Am I sharing? No, I am not. Okay, here we go. So again, I'm not sure what it looks like for you, but anyways, this pathway was a tool that we were actually asked to create mainly from some of the non-Indigenous participants who we consulted with, actually, who, you know, wanted a tool that they could, you know, use to sort of see what this process looks like. So it's relatively straightforward. in the center. So you initiate form a partnership, initiate a partnership, maintain that partnership, and then close the partnership. Okay, Annie's just showing up in the right color, it looks like, which is great. So anyways, there's not a lot of time because we do want to spend some time reflecting before 1 o'clock, but just to share sort of what this tells you is that there are two sections of this infographic, of this sort of pathway to Indigenous community engagement, that might be a little different than what you're used to. So that is the first section, the work before the work, and the final section, the relationship after the work. So you can see in each of these sections, we've listed 3 principles. That's not a comprehensive list of the principles that are in play during those sections. There are just things that were really key in terms of, the kinds of practices and things that we should do at that time. So in the work before the work, we're going to focus on literacy, reflection, and relationships. So we found that a lot of people were making the mistake of proposing university collaborations and partnerships with Indigenous peoples and communities without having first built a foundation for working in good ways. So this first stage, the work before the work, during this period, we spend time learning about the history, language, and culture of the Indigenous community that we're getting to know, or that we're interested in approaching and potentially working with, or who has approached us. It's a time for seriously reflecting on what it means to be a settler on Indigenous land, to be in relationship with Indigenous communities, and then for putting also in that time and energy to form reciprocal, trusting relationships with those communities. So that's that work before the work section. And we are going to be actually reviewing that section at the next Lunch and Learn in 2 weeks, because it's a really crucial section that people often overlook. And then just really quickly, we'll review the last section too, because it's also one of those things that I think folks often sort of miss. They close their program or partnership, and that's sort of it. But we found that there was all of this stuff that folks in the consultations were talking to us about that happened after that section. So again, some of the key principles here are literacy, relationship, and systems change. So really in this last stage, you're going to be demonstrating this ongoing lived commitment to support Indigenous communities in their struggles for resurgence, self-determination, and sovereignty, and to honor relational accountability and follow through in action. So this is a time to continue working on that relationship, to continue building that relationship beyond the partnership and the program that has now closed. And in the context of working in an institution like our university, it also means challenging and actively working to change the systems that make it difficult for community engaged learning practitioners to work in good ways. And also to prioritize relationship maintenance as part of both personal, but also your professional life. So that's just a really fast overview of these stages. And again, this is also in draft form here, but we will be going more in depth into the work before the work at the next Lunch and Learn session. So now I'm going to pass this off to Hedda. So again, the working before the work framework is really about reframing partnership and assessment. So like changing the way that we approach making relationships, but also centering, really taking care of those relationships. So now Hedda's going to talk about relational assessment, which is that piece, that second piece.
Thanks, Nikki. Well, thank you everyone for your attention. So far, so that was a lot of information, but it's just sort of like the quick overview of everything that we'll cover over the next, 9 sessions. So one of the big pieces of our project has been really focusing on the relationship part of a partnership, because a partnership is many things, right? It has sort of like policies and procedures and structures, but it also at the core should have a relationship. And if we go back to the story I told you at the beginning, right, like that program that happened with Indigenous communities in the Amazon region in Ecuador, if we did a program evaluation with our students or even with ourselves, we would be able to check a lot of boxes in terms of like did you learn X? Check. Did you have a good time? Check. Did this and that? Check. But those kind of program evaluations that look at outcomes, at program outcomes, really miss the relationship side of these partnerships. So part of this project has been trying to find a way to create a framework to assess those relationships. And that is mainly, I guess, the responsibility of whoever is coordinating a program or facilitating, but it also involves the participants, involves the community. So throughout all of the principles, we try to find ways to help practitioners and partners engage in this practice and sort of like reframe their approach to evaluation and assessment to really focus on the relationship. So we created a framework. We'll release it when we release the main framework document that we're working on. But again, informed by the consultations, the main areas that came up for a relational assessment were the relationship between communication and trust. So how do you sort of measure, but also understand the level of communication and trust that you have with a partner? And one of the cool things about relational assessment is that the more you do this assessment with your partners, the more you build trust and communication gets better because you're actually talking at a human level. So communication and trust were important. Something else that came up was importance of visiting. So especially from an Indigenous paradigm, visiting is a very important practice for building relationship. When you can, physically showing up, spending time with people without a university business at the table really makes a huge difference. Sharing a cup of tea, a cup of coffee, and just chatting. Or Indigenous partners and the people we consulted with really stress the importance of visiting as assessment. If you get invited to places, if people receive you in their homes, that tells you something about the relationship as well. Another thing is that if you're going to be thinking about relationships with a partnership, you should think of who you hold those relationships with. Sometimes we say we have a partnership with this community, but in reality, you only work with one person, right? Like you work with the coordinator of X, and your relationship is with that one person alone. So this framework of relational assessment also invites us to reflect on who do we have relationships with and who do we need to build those relationships with. Anyone who's done assessment, you probably know that the more diversity you have in the voices that inform that assessment, you get a stronger data set. So that's the idea of diversifying your relationships. And then finally is an awareness that the more you do this exercise of building relationships, the more the type of assessment that you can do with the community will also grow and evolve. At the beginning, if you're just beginning a partnership, if we go back to the stages that Nikki was talking about, if you're on stage 1 and you're going to talk about relationship, you're probably not going to get very intimate and personal, and people are not going to be very open. So you probably will use methods that are more general. But as you go through that pathway and you get deeper into the stages of relationship, then you can do other things. Maybe to break the monotony, you'll include like art-based methods, or you'll have conversations that are much more personal and intimate. So keeping that awareness, the awareness of that evolution in mind is also important. So relational assessment is something, again, that sort of cuts through all of the principles and something that will keep coming up as we go through the Luncheon Learns. So thank you everyone for listening to that bit.
Thank you, Hera, for sharing that. And I know you have to take off now because you have another meeting very shortly. So thanks so much for being here. And obviously we'll see you in a couple of weeks at the next Luncheon Learn.
See you folks next time. Bye-bye.
So now we're actually we're going to turn the recording off so that we can have some